So welcome to this February session of our fourth annual Religions and Practice of Peace Colloquium Series. I'm David Hempton, the Dean of the Harvard Divinity School. Thanks to all of you for being with us tonight, for braving a cold Boston winter. And welcome to everyone, colleagues and friends from across Harvard and the local area, and members of our cross-disciplinary RPP working group and the Sustainable Peace Working Group. We'd like to especially thank our guest speaker, Dr. Erica Chenoweth, for traveling from Denver, Colorado, an equally cold city, but higher and brighter than our one. So thanks so much for making the effort to be with us. We really appreciate it. Erica flew in today and flies out tomorrow, so we're grateful that you've made the time to be with us. We're also grateful to have as our moderator and respondent Dr. Jocelyne Cesari, just on my left, who I'll introduce a bit later. And also I'm grateful to the co-sponsors of tonight's session, the Women's Studies and Religion program at Harvard Divinity School, and Anne Brady, the director, is right here in front of us. And also to the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. We're very glad to have with us Sushma Raman, the Executive Director of the Carr Center, who's just sitting right over here in the front row on the left. Welcome. Thanks for coming over to the Divinity School. It's a really important moment. I think the Kennedy School and Divinity School have just announced an important partnership around a collaboration between the Divinity School and the Middle East Institute at the Kennedy School, which will be working over the next 4 or 5 years on a major new initiative. So it's especially gratifying to have colleagues from the Kennedy School here. Hugh, welcome as well. So thank you for coming. We'd also like to express our appreciation to RPP's generous supporters, including the Reverend Karen Vickers-Budney and Al Budney, for helping make these and other RPP activities possible. And of course, as always, to our wonderful RPP staff and graduate assistants who work tirelessly in organizing these sessions and food and registrations and all of the work that goes into making an event like this possible. So thank you, everyone, for your good work on that. So part of our mission in RPP is to explore how spiritual and human values, positive engagements across religions and cultures, and nonviolent resources can help us as a human family to address our big problems in a way that enhances cooperation, justice, equity, and harmony. And we're pondering these issues with colleagues across Harvard in our emerging Sustainable Peace initiative. And an important related question is the role of nonviolent civil resistance in these pursuits. While many people have long advocated for nonviolence on moral and spiritual grounds, there's now a growing appreciation, I think, of the strategic importance of nonviolence on practical grounds. And we're grateful to be able to benefit tonight from the insights of Dr. Chenoweth, who is a leading expert on the strategic effectiveness of nonviolent civil resistance, who will share her research with us, as well as delve into the role of spiritually engaged communities and women in such movements. We're also delighted to have with us as moderator and respondent Dr. Jocelyne Cesari. Jocelyne holds the chair of religion and politics at the University of Birmingham in the United Kingdom. She is research fellow at Georgetown University's Berkley Center on Religion, Peace, and World Affairs. Her work on religion, political violence, and conflict resolution has garnered recognition and awards from numerous international organizations, such as the Carnegie Council for Ethics and International Affairs, the Royal Society for Arts in the UK, and the European Academy of Religion. She is a professorial fellow at the Institute for Religion, Politics, and Society at the Australian Catholic University, and she teaches on contemporary Islam and politics at Harvard Divinity School and directs the Islam in the West program. Jocelyne is a remarkably productive scholar, as I've just learned tonight. Her most recent book just hot off the press, literally, it's quite warm, is What is Political Islam, published in 2018. And she has also written recently, remarkably, where do you get time, energy, and talent? Her most recent books are Islam, Gender, and Democracy in a Comparative Perspective, OUP 2017, The Awakening of Muslim Democracy, Religion, Modernity, and the State, 2014, and Why the West Fears Islam, an Exploration of Islam in Western Liberal Democracies in 2013. Her book, When Islam and Democracy Meet, Muslims in Europe and the United States, is a reference in the study of European Islam and integration of Muslim minorities in secular democracies. She also edited the 2015 Oxford Handbook of European Islam. So we're delighted, Jocelyne, that you're with us. Thanks for all that you do for our school, and thanks for being here tonight. So I'll invite Jocelyne Cesari to introduce our speaker for tonight.
Thank you. So I'm delighted to introduce Professor Erika Chenoweth. She's an internationally recognized authority on political violence and its alternatives. She's professor and associate dean for research at the Josef Korbel School of International Studies at the University of Denver. Foreign Policy magazine ranked her among the top 100 global thinkers of 2013. Dr. Chenoweth won the 2014 Karl Deutsch Award, given annually by the International Studies Association to the scholar under 40 who has made the most significant impact on the field of international politics or peace research. A book with Maria Stephan, Why Civil Resistance Works, The Strategic Logic of Nonviolent Conflict, won the 2013 Groweyer, I'm not sure I pronounced this right, Growemeyer Award for Ideas Improving World Order, and the 2012 Woodrow Wilson Foundation Award. I can keep going. I keep with the book. Maybe I will shorten on the press information. Dr. Chenoweth has authored or edited 4 books, including The Politics of Terror, Oxford 2018, with Pauline Moore, Rethinking Violence, States and Non-State Actors in Conflict, MIT 2010, with Adria Lawrence, Why Civil Resistance Works, Columbia University Press 2011, with Maria Stephan, and Political Violence, by Sage in 2013. Her research has been featured in the New York Times, the Washington Post, Foreign Affairs, The Economist, the Boston Globe, and that's what I'm going to shorten a little, okay? She co-hosts the blog Political Violence at a Glance, hosts the blog Rational Insurgent, and blogs occasionally at the Monkey Cage, which is, I think, hosted by the Washington Post, right? Along with Mary Berry, she co-directs the Inclusive Global Leadership Initiative, which seeks to shine a light on the work of women activists around the world. And along with Jeremy Pressman, she co-directs the Crowd Counting Consortium, a public interest project that documents political mobilization in the US during the Trump administration. She holds a PhD and an MA in political science from the University of Colorado and a BA in political science and German from the University of Dayton. Please help me welcome Dr. Chenoweth.
Well, thank you very much for the warm welcome, and it's nice to see some familiar faces in the crowd and to meet all of you. Thank you for coming out for an evening event. Delighted to have an opportunity to speak with you here at the Harvard Divinity School. This is my first time here, even though I spent a couple years as a postdoc at the Kennedy School about a decade ago at this point. I just want to thank the organizers and Dean Hempton and the others that I've had contact with, the people who have staffed this event and are providing the food and facilities for this event, for their good work. I want to thank the co-sponsors, the Carr Center and the Women's Studies and Religion program for hosting this event. And I also would be remiss if I didn't mention that Gene Sharp, who is kind of the father of this field of strategic nonviolent action, passed away in East Boston a week and a half ago. And it is not an exaggeration to say that I wouldn't be here at all right now if it weren't for the monumental contributions of Gene Sharp to this field, to the world, and to the research that I'm about to present. So this will be a wholly inadequate tribute to his contributions to the world. But needless to say, everything I'm about to present was inspired largely by Gene's work. And so I just want to put that out there at the beginning. So I was asked to come and talk with this group of people here at the Harvard Divinity School and the Religions and the Practice of Peace Colloquium Series about some political science research on the strategic logic of nonviolent resistance. And I think Dean Hempton set up this question nicely at the outset by saying that while many different spiritual and religiously minded communities and groups have long advocated nonviolence on moral or spiritual grounds, there is and has been over the past 60 or 70 years a growing community of scholars and practitioners who have advocated nonviolent resistance on more strategic or pragmatic grounds. And what I want to do with this talk today is focus first on that set of arguments and the evidence that form some basis of support for it, and then talk a little bit about the ways that I see productive linkages between spiritually minded or faith-based communities and this sort of strategic approach. And in some way, I'm going to argue toward the end that this is, in many ways, a false dichotomy, at least in practice, if not in theory. So I was motivated to take up the question of whether nonviolent resistance was as effective or more effective than armed struggle in achieving major political and social goals. About a decade ago, a little more than a decade ago at this point, when I first was introduced to the work of Gene Sharp and others, Peter Ackerman, Jack Duvall, Kurt Schock, many others, who were making this argument that nonviolent resistance could be in many ways a functional equivalent to armed struggle. And there were many different cases from around the world that suggested that people power movements where unarmed civilians were using a variety of techniques like protests, boycotts, strikes, stay-aways in coordinated fashion could actually actively confront their opponents without having to harm them physically and still achieve major gains, if not everything that they were asking for. And so these very convincing case studies from around the world were surprising to me as somebody who was studying political violence because many of the different cases that were being discussed were cases that we would typically associate with armed insurrection. So for example, one of the key examples that came up in this literature was the People Power movement in the Philippines, which I had really never heard about. I had heard about all of the armed insurgencies, US counterinsurgency programs in the Philippines and the like, but I hadn't really known much about the People Power movement, even though it was one of the best known and best documented mass mobilizations in the last century. And this was surprising as well because the field of political science had largely marginalized the study of nonviolent civil resistance and instead privileged the study of essentially things that blow up. So what happened is that my colleague Maria Stefan and I set out to collect data on all known mass mobilizations from 1900 to 2006. That date of 2006 is merely a function of the timing of our collaboration. We started working together in 2006. So we collected data on all known mass mobilizations where people were actually making claims that would result in the overthrow of a dictatorship or territorial independence, either through secession, through kicking out of foreign military occupation, through anti-colonial movements, or through some other form of self-determination. And the reason we studied these cases in particular is because these claims are what political scientists would call maximalist claims. They would fundamentally reorder the shape of the society and the state that these groups are confronting. And the reason that we picked those cases is because for those studying armed insurrection, these typified those types of mobilizations. And there was a sense that we didn't want to collect data for comparison against those armed campaigns, where the nonviolent movements were basically looking for reform or the expansion of rights short of kind of full regime overthrow or territorial independence. Another thing that we did was we cut off the campaigns only to movements that had already mobilized at least 1,000 observed participants. So we're already looking at kind of mature, major mobilizations. And then we categorized them into two different groups. One is groups that use primarily armed struggle as their main mode of confronting the opponent, and the other is groups that use primarily nonviolent resistance methods as their primary mode of confrontation. Of course, there is kind of a middle-of-the-road category, which we classified usually as primarily nonviolent campaigns with violent flanks. This becomes important, and I'll refer back to these cases toward the end of my talk. And then we basically assigned them an outcome, whether these campaigns succeeded in achieving their goals or not. And in order to succeed, they had to have achieved their stated outcome within a year of the peak of the campaign in terms of mobilization. They had to have had a decided impact on the outcome. So like if a dictator died of a heart attack in office, we wouldn't count that as a success, even though you could make the claim that indirectly the movement's stress might have contributed to that outcome. And we also, they had to have achieved what they said they wanted. So in other words, they had to actually topple a regime dictatorship, not just force a dictator to hold elections and then win them. Again, even though that would be a major concession to such movements, we wanted to adopt a very strict definition of success. Now, why did we limit our definitions and our scope so much? Well, a backstory to this is that Maria and I were somewhat antagonistic collaborators. Maria anticipated that nonviolent resistance movements would be really successful, and I anticipated that they would be really not successful. And so in order to sort of set up the intellectual bet in the most honest way, we examined the hardest campaigns and the hardest ways to succeed, the hardest definition of success that we could come up with. So after all that business, which took about a year and a half, we circulated our list of 320 plus campaigns during that time period around the world to experts in the field to make sure that we had captured them and characterized them appropriately. And once we did that, we performed the analysis, and basically the descriptive statistics are what's on this slide. As you'll see, I've updated these data now through 2015, so, but they're basically identical findings to those that ended in 2016. So the nonviolent campaigns have been about twice as effective as their violent counterparts. They've also been more likely to achieve major concessions short of full success. And certainly they're much less likely to fail than their violent counterparts. Now, one of the things that's particularly interesting, and I think incredibly important and relevant to those who want to undertake research or practice on this topic, is the dramatic growth in the use of nonviolent civil resistance over time. In fact, if we updated this last set of bars through 2017, we definitely live in the most contentious decade on record since 1900 in terms of onsets of new maximalist nonviolent uprisings. And as you can also see, the onsets of new violent insurgencies of this type have declined. This is not something you'd necessarily glean from the nightly news. But in fact, violent insurgency is kind of going out of style, and nonviolent civil resistance is becoming the primary mode of contention in our time. So for somebody like me, this raises a series of really interesting questions. The first is, why is nonviolent resistance so much more effective than armed struggle? And when we dug into the data, the primary reason or characteristic of nonviolent campaigns that differentiates them from armed insurgencies is their sheer size. The average nonviolent campaign is something like 11 times larger as a proportion of the total population of a country than the average violent campaign. And this is really important in explaining why these campaigns are able to assemble the mass power that they are to affect change. Now, it's not rocket science to suggest that the larger any kind of revolutionary campaign is, the more likely it is to succeed. Scholars of revolutions and social movements and civil war have long argued that participation bases are really important in determining the outcomes of any type of challenge against entrenched authority. Mark Lickbach, who is a political economist at the University of Maryland, in 1995 wrote a book called The Rebel's Dilemma, in which he speculated that if 5% of the population of a country rose up against its government, no government on the planet could withstand such a challenge, because it just imposed way too many costs on that, on the government to either suppress the campaign or to mix suppression and concessions in a way that would basically collapse or topple the regime. That was a speculated number based on formal models and some economic models, but wasn't tested on data on mass uprisings. So in our data, in fact, the threshold is even lower than 5%. It's 3.5% of the population, after which, if 3.5% of a population rise up, we haven't counted any cases where that campaign failed. The key trick here, though, is that the campaigns that are more likely to cross that 3.5% threshold are nonviolent ones, because they are able to elicit much larger bases of support than the average violent uprising. So why is that? Well, armed struggle requires a number, or has a number of different barriers to participation that make it very difficult for many armed movements to become as inclusive and participatory as they otherwise would like to be. The first is a high physical barrier for participation. Now, of course, there are many different forms of passive and indirect support for armed insurrection, but those that actually participate in the fighting and in armed confrontations against the opponents usually have to fit a certain physical profile. They have to have a certain set of physical abilities. They have to be willing to take a certain set of physical risks that naturally precludes the participation of very large proportions of the population. Nonviolent campaigns, on the other hand, have such a large and diverse array of available techniques of struggle that many people, regardless of their level of physical ability or willingness to expose themselves to risk, can participate. So, for example, many nonviolent campaigns have used the general strike paired with the stay-at-home demonstration as one of their key tools in their toolkit. Now, a stay-at-home demonstration requires you to basically hang out for a few days. You want to make sure you have enough stuff to keep you busy, but it doesn't require direct exposure to the opponent, yet it can be an incredibly, incredibly powerful technique of non-cooperation that can shut down the economy of an urban area if enough people do it. So it does allow the participation of people that wouldn't ordinarily want to stand in front of a tank or in fact, shoot at one. The second lower barrier to participation is a lower commitment barrier. And by this doesn't mean commitment to the cause, but rather how hard it is to get into an insurrection and how hard it is to get out of it once you're in. So for many armed groups, it's actually hard to join if you're not willing to kill somebody. And many armed groups actually ask their recruits to engage in violence against the opponent when they join to make sure that they're not infiltrators. It's a screening technique. And the trick is that once that's done, it's very hard to get out because the group becomes basically your protection. So for nonviolent campaigns, there's a much lower commitment barrier because people don't necessarily have to give up their day job. They don't necessarily have to use the group as their sole source of protection and so forth in order to participate. There's also a lower informational barrier. This is to say that many different recruits or volunteers for armed insurrection always want to know how big the group is, how many people they're actually going to meet when they decide to join the group, and kind of relatedly, how likely is it that the group is going to be successful. And it's hard to know without actually showing up, because many armed groups kind of advertise their size by using different types of armed activities that make them look bigger than they are, like different types of assassination campaigns, street fighting, and the use of powerful improvised weapons and things to make large detonations. And they essentially are trying to signal their size and capacity, but without showing really how many of them there are. Nonviolent campaigns, many of the techniques that are used, particularly protests and demonstrations, are actively there to generate common knowledge about the size of the group and to reassure people that would like to join that they're not going to be alone. There's a really powerful kind of cognitive process around safety and numbers. Our brains tell us whether we should be afraid of going to a crowd or not, largely based on how big it is and how much fun it looks like. So, for example, if you're sitting in your apartment one night and your neighbor comes to you and says, we're going to have a mass demonstration down in the public square at 10 o'clock tonight. We anticipate police are going to show up at some point, but we've talked before, and I know that you sympathize with the cause, so I hope you make it. If you're like me, you're probably not going to look out your window at 9:45 and just say, I'm just going to show up at the square and see how many people come. You're probably going to wait until like 10:30 and look out the window and see if it looks like a party. And if it looks like a party, then you're probably going to show up and probably stand in the middle if it actually is dangerous. So a lot of the techniques themselves generate these, what cognitive psychologists refer to as common knowledge generators, which is just that process that's almost subconscious, letting us know that we're actually safe to participate. And then there are lower cognitive barriers to participation. This is simply to say that a person doesn't have to override whatever hesitation they have to kill others in order to participate in a nonviolent campaign. So why do numbers matter? It's not necessarily just because the swelling of large crowds just inevitably leads to kind of catastrophic or triumphant change in the country's setting. But rather because very large numbers of people who represent a diverse range of sectors in the society allow a movement to make use of political leverage that comes to them as a result of this mass participation. So if there are a large number of women, elderly, people with disabilities, minority groups, or others who are typically marginalized from the population, and young people who feel that they can participate, then that gives the movement access to all of their friends, their neighbors, their business associates, their extended family, and many others who can be affected by the participation of their acquaintances. And this has real political effects. And this is where I'll return somewhat to some of the insights produced by Gene Sharp and others influenced by his work. So really, the way that civil resistance works is not by melting the heart of the opponent. It's not necessarily by appealing to the morality of the opponent and converting them to one side. Instead, it rests on the assumption that there is no such thing as a tyrant who isn't 100% dependent on the cooperation, obedience, and help of people that reside in various pillars of support. And in fact, every tyrant, no matter how tyrannical, is completely reliant and dependent on the continued cooperation of people that work in the security forces, economic and business elites, civilian bureaucrats, state media, religious and cultural authorities, educational institutions, and the like. And then what happens is that the larger the number of participants and the more diverse those participants are, the more likely they are to have direct access to people in these pillars of support. They're their family members. They are people that have their kids in the same school and would like to live with one another side by side in the long term, likely. They would rather stay uninvolved in major political conflicts between the opponent and the challengers. But at a certain point, they may feel they have to make a choice. So the way that this often looks is that there may be mass mobilizations for many months that look like they're having very little effect, but they're producing a lot of kind of attention, and they're starting to set the agenda, they're starting to dominate political space. And then there might be kind of a key moment where all of a sudden people power movements start to initiate loyalty changes among erstwhile regime elites. And once those loyalty shifts start, that's when you start to see these pillars of support crumble. So if the opponent tries to lean on them to replenish power, they're not available. A very concrete example of this happened in Serbia in 2000, where hundreds of thousands of people descended on Belgrade in late September and early October of 2000 to demand that Slobodan Milosevic leave office after fraudulent elections. And what happened there is that some of the organizers of the mass demonstrations in the parliamentary square in Belgrade had stolen police walkie-talkies. And so they actually heard the order come down that the police should fire live fire on the demonstrators. And they could see that the police just stood there and didn't take any action. So of course, journalists and scholars rushed in to ask the police why they didn't. And they said very interesting and enlightening things, like, I thought I saw my children in the crowd, or I thought I saw the guy who sells me liquor on a Saturday in the crowd at a discount, and I didn't want to lose my discount, or very banal kind of like personal micro-level relationships that then translate into like mass political power in key moments. So importantly, the responses don't necessarily indicate that change of heart, but rather an interest calculation in people that reside in these pillars of support about whether it's in their own short and long-term interests to continue to obey or to disobey. So this is a hypothesis that was articulated by Sharp and others. And so Maria and I tested it on data from our data set where what we looked at is the probability of increased participation of these campaigns on the likelihood that security forces themselves would defect. And defection doesn't mean put down your guns and join the other side necessarily. It can be non-cooperation or disobedience, as I mentioned. But it certainly is a very strong association. The association is not the same for armed campaigns. So security forces typically don't become any more likely to defect to an armed campaign or disobey their authority when an armed campaign becomes very large. In fact, they tend to start fighting for their lives. So sometimes, of course, there is lethal repression against nonviolent mass movements. In fact, most of these movements are emerging because they live in a very oppressive system in the first place, and it's the way that they see available to try to contest it. But they're making maximalist claims that will fundamentally alter the nature of their societies. And so almost all of them in our data set experience some degree of lethal repression at some point in the campaign's life cycle. But even in those cases where there was lethal oppression, the nonviolent campaigns were still outperforming the violent ones by a 2-to-1 margin. And the reasons for this, we think, are, first of all, that repression against unarmed people is politically riskier. Sharp called this political jujitsu, or using the opponent's strength against them as its core weakness. Here, the idea is basically that when states crack down on primarily unarmed civilians, it elicits outrage among the population that sees it as excessive or disproportionate to the threat. This same dynamic is not seen necessarily with regard to repression against armed campaigns. It may produce outrage, but that outrage usually does not result in subsequent increases in mobilization. The other issue is that repression can be practically much costlier against very large campaigns, which nonviolent campaigns tend to be. The reason is because there is a widespread availability to very large campaigns of different types of methods that reduce exposure to risk of repression. So some people call this a differentiation between methods of concentration and methods of dispersion. Concentration is when very large numbers of people assemble mass in a key area. It's incredibly disruptive. It makes all the front page news pictures. So you've probably seen pictures like this in major newspapers because it's very dramatic looking. And lots of people doing something at the same time nonviolently is interesting. The problem is that if it's all a campaign does, if all they do is assemble mass over and over again in the same place, it becomes very risky in most of these settings because it's very easy for the opponent to anticipate, surround them, and use very lethal forms of repression, using encirclement and the like. And the other thing is it becomes very predictable, so it loses some of its leverage or disruptive power. So very large movements can shift to methods of dispersion. These are where people stay away from places they're expected to go, like this strike in Kashmir, actually, where what this picture is showing is the outcome of an organization's call for a mass demonstration in the kind of gallery where this is taking place. And they had announced this for many weeks before and told the security forces they would be there. And then what they didn't tell them was that actually it was a strike. So the security forces came out and nobody was there. So instead what you see, you never see this picture in the front page news because nobody knows what you're looking at. You're looking at a very powerful economic tool of non-cooperation, while also forcing the regime to put people out front and pay them, probably overtime, to stand there bored, really bored, and maybe not getting paid, and just it's not the most fun thing to be doing. And so, one of the things that is really interesting is that some very skilled movements are able to shift between these methods of concentration and methods of dispersion in ways that ramp up disruption while simultaneously reducing exposure to risk for the large number of people participating. A clear example of this was during the Iranian Revolution of 77 to 79, where during the final kind of climax of this movement, the 100 days of the 100 Days Revolution, the first 90 or so days were street demonstrations, funeral processions, and other things. And those were very disruptive. About 10% of the Iranian population participated at that time. It was an incredibly cross-cutting mass mobilization, one of the largest in the 20th century for sure, against the Shah. And after that first 90 or so days, people, there were thousands of deaths. I mean, people were the movement, the uprising was sustaining real casualties, and it wasn't really clear what direction it was going to go. And then the oil workers in the sort of rural areas went on strike. And when they did that, they paired it with the stay-at-home demonstrations. So the security forces had to go door to door and pull those oil workers back out onto the streets and march them to the oil fields where they worked at half pace. And the next day, it was the same story. They, went door to door, pulled these oil workers back out onto the streets, marched them to the oil fields where they worked at half pace. After a few more days of this, people in the security forces started calling in sick because they did not want to continue that level of interpersonal repression in places where they expected to want to live with their families for the rest of their lives down the streets from these people whose houses they were entering unwanted. And they also anticipated that they were not going to get their overtime because the oil fields were pumping in half pace and there was nothing they could do about it. So they defected en masse by calling in sick. And this was a kind of clever form of non-cooperation with plausible deniability. And within a couple more days, the Shah had to leave the country. So what happens in countries where civil resistance campaigns succeed? I've been really interested in trying to assess the longer-term impacts of these campaigns over the past couple of years. And there are three really important outcomes that speak to the relative costs of armed insurrection compared with nonviolent resistance. One of them deals with just the onset of mass atrocities, here defined as when a state kills more than 1,000 unarmed people in a single spell. And what you'll see here is a comparison of mass killings in the context of major uprisings, when those uprisings are violent and when they're nonviolent. And there's a dramatic difference in the number of nonviolent episodes that experience these mass killings, primarily because of that defection outcome that is more likely to happen with nonviolent campaigns. And what many different dictators recognize, or colonial authorities recognize, when they are considering how to deal with the mass movement, is that it is risky to even order live fire or any type of real lethal repression on unarmed demonstrators because they risk the defections happening. So it's very hard for us to know whether this trend is because the leaders know how risky it is and they don't want their security forces to defect outright, and so they just never, they order other things like crowd control tactics and whatever, or whether when they order it, the defections take place. And it seems to be a combination of the two. Another very interesting difference in terms of the long-term outcomes of these campaigns is that nonviolent countries in which there were nonviolent campaigns are something like 10 times more likely to emerge as democratic countries 5 years after the campaign is over. And we think this is partially because armed campaigns tend to adhere kind of martial values that, if victorious, kind of reconstitute themselves in the nature of the rule of the new leaders, whereas nonviolent campaigns, because they're so large and inclusive, because there's already been kind of the development of a consensus, the establishment of norms of nonviolent conflict resolution and fair play in the context of the campaign, that they're more likely to sort of replicate those norms in the new government. We also look at the probability that civil wars will break out in countries in which these two different campaign types have taken place within a decade, and nonviolent campaigns are about, countries in which there have been nonviolent campaigns are about 15% less likely to experience civil war onset than armed campaigns. And these are all, of course, controlling for lots of other factors that would influence those outcomes. So all told, there really seem to be 4 different characteristics that are present in campaigns that succeed. The first is that they tend to build very large and diverse bases of participation. They tend to maintain them over time. They tend to increase the size and diversity over time. The second is that they use a variety of nonviolent methods. That is to say, they don't stick to a single set of techniques like protest or persuasion, but they branch out into using different forms of non-cooperation, developing parallel institutions or other forms of nonviolent intervention, as Sharp would call them, and the like. The third thing is that they elicit those loyalty shifts and key pillars of support. It's not always the case that these will be security forces. There are many contexts in which it's incredibly unlikely that security forces would ever defect in the face of a nonviolent campaign. In South Africa, for example, it was going to be very unlikely that any of the pro-apartheid police were going to defect to the majority anti-apartheid movement that the black townships were mobilizing and so forth. So instead of focusing on trying to elicit security force defections, that movement focused on economic defections, which were very successful through boycotts of white businesses in South Africa, as well as the international sanctions and divestment campaigns that they cultivated through their transnational solidarity networks. And then the fourth thing that they tend to do is they tend to maintain discipline, even as repression escalates. Now, what does this mean? It basically means that the campaign stays on the initiative and sticks to its plan, and is not provoked into doing things that it otherwise wouldn't want to do, like adopting an armed wing that then was coming to the defense of the movement, or embracing an armed wing that self-initiates. So as I wrap up, I just want to point out that there have been some recent kind of declines in the absolute success rates of nonviolent resistance campaigns. It seems that something shifted somewhere in the mid-2000s, where we started to see an absolute decline in the effectiveness, although not a relative decline. What I mean by this is that armed campaigns have not become any more successful. In fact, they've become less successful than in prior decades. They're the least successful of any time in the 20th century at this point. But nonviolent campaigns have also become less successful in the past few years. Now, there are lots of ways that we could explain this. We could explain it by just kind of an authoritarian learning curve, where different dictatorships are becoming better at suppressing nonviolent dissent. We could explain it by the massive increase in the onset of nonviolent civil resistance campaigns that may be set on prematurely. because they were excited by things happening in their region, and so they mobilized before having prepared for a multi-year mass campaign. We could also explain it by the fact that there might be a shift in the character of many of the nonviolent movements that have been setting on recently. And one of the shifts in character is the greater willingness, it seems, of different nonviolent campaigns these days to embrace those violent flanks. Now here, the way that we define violent flanks is parts of a primarily nonviolent movement that begin to routinize the use of violence against the opponent, so that 99% of the people are still engaged in nonviolent resistance, but there are small groups within the movement or individuals within the movement that kind of always show up and engage in violent action, or the movement actually outright has an armed wing. I'm doing work right now to even further differentiate those two dynamics, but that's what counts here. And one of the things that I think might be interesting to this group also is a tendency to move away from or abandon some of the spiritual roots of nonviolent resistance within many contemporary nonviolent movements. In the scholarship, there was a real rationale for this, which was manifested in the fact that pacifism as a form of knowledge was largely subjugated after World War II. So there was a huge, huge body of literature on pacifism from political philosophy, from political science, well, political science really wasn't around yet, but diplomatic history and other things which burgeoned in the first half of the 20th century and then was largely subjugated in the field after World War II. They kind of lost the argument and were marginalized, and then very few people wanted to openly identify as pacifist scholars after World War II. Richard Jackson has a really terrific set of articles on this right now. So at the same time, this is happening, we have Gandhi, who gave civil resistance its name, whose work directly inspired the work of Gene Sharp, who lived and worked in an ashram and actively produced an autobiography that informed many different nonviolent activists throughout the second half of the 20th century, but was largely read at that point as a pragmatist, in part to navigate around the subjugation of pacifism as a form of knowledge. And so what we can see here is just that as nonviolent resistance, Gandhi's own named tactic, has increased around the world, mentions of Gandhi in books have declined rapidly. So it's kind of interesting that this is not like, it's statistically significant, but it's not very good data because it's just Google Ngrams. And it's just English language books. But it's something that I think is interesting because with my familiarity of different contemporary nonviolent movements, the spiritual roots of the technique are largely set aside, and the sort of pragmatic elements are largely what motivate people to use it and to discuss it. And so what I want to wrap up with is a quick discussion about how I see faith communities as having played such a key role in many of these nonviolent campaigns, whether they want to admit it or not, and how we can sort of recapture or revive these types of associations going forward. So of course, one of the things that faith communities have always done with regard to nonviolent campaigns is that they have helped to express claims based on universal morality that has had widespread resonance precisely because of their grassroots. So the abolitionists, for example, made many of their claims on the basis of Christian theology. The anti-nuclear and peace movements made many of their claims, again, on the basis of Christian theology. And in fact, the Fellowship of Reconciliation, the Nobel Peace Prize winning multi-faith organization that's still around, again, was like a key movement in articulating the rationale for peace and the end of war, and is now very much involved in discussions around what justice looks like in the 21st century. During the civil rights movement, the SCLC was absolutely vital in articulating the claims of civil rights in the United States. The Reverend William N. Barber today has his Moral Mondays, project, which very much has kind of resonance across many different communities on the basis of universal moral claims rooted in Christian theology. We also have examples of mass mobilization motivated largely by the articulation of claims to human rights that emanated from Catholic theologians and practitioners like Bishop Romero in El Salvador. Today, the Catholic Nonviolence Initiative is underway. How many people have heard of this? Great. A few people. So the Catholic Nonviolence Initiative is a multi-group initiative to provide robust empirical and theological support to Pope Francis to call into question the just war doctrine of the Catholic tradition, and to really lobby to try to have him issue a new encyclical centering peace and nonviolence in the Catholic tradition, which would be, by the way, a huge deal. Because, of course, the flip side of this is that the Catholic Church was instrumental in articulating the just war doctrine, which is the rationale for when it's okay to use violence, which it turns out can basically be rationalized anytime based on just war doctrine. The second thing that faith communities can do is that they convene and build capacity for social movements that otherwise don't have a great deal of social space for this. Consciousness raising is a major form of this that can take place at the pulpit when ministers and lay ministers talk to the most important issues of the day. Trainings take place in churches always because they seem to enjoy, in many contexts, some immunity from intrusion by the state. They can provide sources of leadership, both moral, spiritual, and practical leadership of mass movements. They can be sites for communication, just places where people come to learn what's next in a movement. They can be sites of deliberation. One of the most poignant examples of this that I've heard of was in the U.S. Civil Rights Movement. Many of the black churches in the South were sites where people would deliberate what they needed to do next and whether they could handle it given the atrocities of the previous week. So, for example, one of my colleagues told me that in her church, every Thursday they would gather together and have song and praise. And then the minister would get up and say, "Shall we march on Sunday?" Because there'd been a killing or a bombing or some other lynching or something really dramatic and traumatic to the community, and they weren't sure whether they could do it, whether they could march on Sunday, given this, or whether they needed to heal on Sunday. And so the Thursday sessions were there for the community to allow itself time and space to deliberate what was possible for them in that moment, so that they all knew by consensus the next time they marched on Sunday, they were all prepared for it, and they were prepared to do it within the parameters that had been agreed upon by the core council. Faith communities can provide important capacity for internal dispute mediation. This is something that I don't know how many of you have been involved in social movements or in activist organizations, but they argue, sometimes pretty bad, right? One of the key challenges for such movements is division and splintering. Division and splintering is probably I don't know what the number one way they fail is, but I would say that's probably the number one way. Civil resistance is a divide and rule strategy. Obviously, one of the better ways to crush them is to divide them. So basically, I think faith communities often have capacities for dispute mediation or dispute resolution that can assist movements in navigating their problems. Certainly, they can provide some of the moral and spiritual rationale for maintaining nonviolent discipline. Of course, there are pragmatic arguments for doing it, but in general, with many of the movements with which I'm familiar, if it's a pragmatic decision, then it can also be a pragmatic decision to stop doing it. And one of the key critiques of people like Kevin Clements and others of my work and the work of Sharp and other people that focus on strategic nonviolent action is that by missing out on the moral dimensions of the use of nonviolent resistance, you give people no reason to stick to it if they decide that it's not working in the short term. And then finally, churches simply have access to very huge numbers of people in the society. And so they can be places where mass mobilization can emanate from in ways that would be very difficult to organize, especially in quite repressive places. They can be sites of tactical innovation and creativity. Mosques during the Arab Awakenings were absolutely crucial in organizing flash mobs and mass demonstrations after Friday prayers. In the People Power movement in the Philippines, there was a very important moment where Marcos actually ordered his Air Force to bomb mass demonstrators that were gathered in the streets. And some of the helicopters went out to drop essentially barrel bombs, very similar to what Assad has used in Syria, on these mass demonstrators. And this was known because there had been a coup and some of the colonels had radios and they heard that this was going to happen. So they warned the people, and a group of nuns actually got together and formed their bodies in the shape of a cross right in the middle of the square. So when the helicopters came over and saw that, they just flew away. They could not do it. And so again, it sort of provides a tactic that's creative but also appeals to this universal sense of morality, which in that moment, it probably didn't win over the people who were about to bomb them, but it definitely dissuaded them in the moment from taking that action. Certainly, faith communities can be sources of spiritual comfort and nourishment. Again, in the process of the civil rights movement, I think that it was not irrelevant that Black churches in the South were leading in this way, and that the churches provided opportunities for communities to heal together in the context of incredible brutality, both before and during the movement. And certainly churches have often provided safe haven, and we see this happening again in the United States today, with the sanctuary movement having resurrected itself in the face of an increase in mass deportation. So one thing I want to mention is that certainly contemporary movements, as I've mentioned, have seemed to move away from the sort of spiritual and moral roots of nonviolent resistance. And that begs a question as to why. I don't know why, but I'll just tell you what I think. What I think is that many of the different movements today have seemed to hang on to more secular, rational, kind of legal claims in the Weberian sense, compared to sort of traditional moral universalist claims, which have largely kind of been, I think, abdicated to the right. And so kind of progressive left movements have moved more into sort of rationalist dimensions of arguments about rights, about justice, and so forth. And in the context of contemporary social movements in the West, I think part of the reason for this is that they tend to be oriented around exactly upending what they see as traditional values or challenging existing power structures, which can sometimes include faith traditions and communities that have sometimes been perceived as sites reinforcing patriarchy, heteronormativity, economic inequality, and racial and ethnic discrimination. In other words, many movements today seem to think that faith is something to challenge, not to ally with. I think that there are certainly examples that we could pull from where faith communities have kind of reinforced oppressive practices or rationalized violence, particularly in excluding communities that otherwise, different progressive movements around the world today are trying to include. So on that note, I think that one of the things that is a challenge for contemporary practitioners of civil resistance and nonviolent action is to try to kind of make the argument that there is a way to recover the moral and spiritual roots and traditional values in a way that is actually inclusive, that includes more people, and that doesn't exclude people. And that might actually be one of the keys to making sure that nonviolent movements are actually nonviolent movements, that the alternatives that they articulate for a vision of a sustainably peaceful society resonate with very large numbers of people, including those that may have been their critics. But I think one of the ultimate important lessons here is just that armed struggle does indeed have realistic alternatives, that faith communities, along with everyone else, recognizing this will absolutely contribute to a greater sense of peace and justice around the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Erica. This is a very important work because it put statistical validity on the knowledge that was empirically done for several decades. And you mentioned Sharp. I didn't know he died. So there have been work done on the efficiency and also the rise of non-violent political resistance for decades. But this is indeed a way to convince, and you mentioned them several times, the community of political scientists who indeed tend to take the opposite route. I would like to focus my comments on 3 points. The first one would be more a question to you and to the audience about the impact of this argument on existing conflict. The second point will be about the difference between civil resistance and nonviolence. And the third point, what's the specificity of the religious dimension in this kind of resistance? So if we take this argument, indeed, nonviolence resistant works. So what is the impact or the relevance of this kind of demonstration on the current unfolding conflicts? And that's where the response is difficult for everybody. Because what scholars like Charles Tilly, you mentioned the social movement, Macadam, Taro, keep saying is that there is no clear-cut response. That what makes any outcome, either in terms of strategy or efficiency, is what kind of interaction is already there between the different actors. So in other words, the choice of a strategy, as well as the outcome of it, is not the addition of the goodwill of people or the rational choice of individuals. It is something that has to do with the relations between different actors. And this has a practical consequence that we are not using enough, which is how do we intervene on the relationship between opponent and challengers. And there are case studies that are successful. In Colombia, in the northwest of the country, this was one of the most ravaged countries by political violence. And what happened is locally, the church, because the church was not seen automatically on one side or the other, created an initiative called the Educational Citadel in the decade of 2000. And what happened, the gangs, the families, the local administration came all together. This is the kind of relationship, interaction, that may foster, you know, the decline of violence or the choice of non-violence. So I can give more, but I don't want to be too long on that. So this is my first point. What is the impact of this argument on existing conflict? And maybe, shift also to the context and the relations between actors. The second point is about civil resistance and non-violence. And I would like also here to bring a thread of scholarship that keeps saying that that's not the same. Actually, most of your data argue in favor of civil resistance. So civil resistance, what does this mean? It involves a construction of a collective identity, B, a definition of action, and C, a program and organization. So without this kind of condition, non-violence is then simply a spontaneous movement that may not accomplish its goal. And here, maybe I can get some help here. I want to show that's what some call the Tiananmen, and you call also the Tiananmen syndrome. Mm-hmm. This is an example of spontaneous protest, mm-hmm. non-violent spontaneous protest that doesn't achieve any goal. We don't learn from it. That's the problem I'm having here. How much of all our thinking as scholars is really channeled in the understanding that people have also on the ground. And the other most recent one, because it's directly related to the Syrian conflict, is this one. This was 2012, the March of the Brides. 3 women saying in Damascus, we don't want that. We don't want violence. But there is no definition of action, no program and organization. So the key operation here is maybe not non-violence. It may be what are the conditions for civil resistance. That's what Gandhi, referring to his own movement that you mentioned, he was very adamant to say, don't come with all these ideas that, we are all peaceful because we are religious. What did he say? He said that the success of his movement could be called a mathematically proportionate success.
Yeah.
I know this kind of argument from scholarship goes against the romantic vision of everybody moving together and destituting the tyrann. But this goes back to the point that when you have only protests that are not organized, that there is no clear political vision behind, then it fails. The Arab Spring is unfortunately a case in point. It started as non-violent political kind of expression, enough is enough. But what did we see? We saw at some point that this protest could not maintain unity among people, and the moment that the protest or the initiative became partisan issue, started the fragilization of the whole thing, and the fact that indeed the state, what's called the deep state, the military, had no intention at all to give up the power. So there is a lot of, again, it's about the relation, what is the capacity of this movement to succeed in democracy versus non-democracy. I mean, democratic countries are more, friendly to this kind of protest, even when they are not mass movement and organized movements. The protest, the women march against Trump is a good example. I know you're following this slowly. But in non-democratic context, you need to be organized. And you need to have a clear consensual vision. That's what I'm saying. It's not only the mass, it's the organization. If you have one or the other in non-democratic context, you may not succeed. The third point I want to make is about the religious dimension of it. And that's where the scholars who work on religion and violence, like Rona Sneer, Scott Thomas, Cecilia Lynch, usually do not connect with this kind of work. Mm-hmm. We belong to a tribe, a political science, which is also divided. So this is very interesting to see that they do not connect with this kind of work. And why? Because most of the time they fail to see the specific of the religious dimension in this kind of argument on nonviolence. Most of the scholarship on religion and politics now is clearly saying that to use the term of a late of one of this group, Alfred Stepan, religion is multivocal. We cannot say it's either or. And history shows that religion can fall on either side of the argument, violent or non-violent, and it can be used by state and civil society alike. And that's where religion, when religion is seen as divisive, that's where the problem starts. That's why you were, at the end of your talk, you were mentioning the fact that maybe, faith is not anymore seen as part of the consensus. Yes, that's the point. You cannot say everybody is an agreement on the role of religion, even in American society. So imagine in other societies where religion has been politicized from the get-go. It is a divisive element. So that's also very interesting to see that the scholars who do peace building are not listened to by the scholars who do religion and violence. Because they say, you are just seeing the tippy top of the proverbial iceberg, and if you don't dig into it, take into account the context, and look at the connections, you're not going to get very far. And also this scholar, like Alfred Stepan, late Alfred Stepan, or even David Steele, they keep saying, we know how to bring success in conflict resolution, and you peace-building expert, you don't. And they say, Alfred Stepan was very proud of saying, I have contributed to the transition in a peaceful way in Latin America from the military region. And David Steele has spent his time in Bosnia after the conflict, talking, organizing groups. And that's what the scholars say. You do not do only personal, individual work. You have to work on intergroup relations. And this circles back to my first point about the relational. And so I would say that it's a shame that this field is so fragmented. You see, you have the peace building, you have the religion and politics, and they don't all automatically mix. So I really appreciate knowing from, where you come from. This is a very difficult, challenging work to do, and thank you for doing it. Thank you. Voilà, I stop here.
Thanks. Thank you for those incredibly great comments. Very engaging and gives me a lot of food for thought. The first question, so you brought up a few things related to this issue of the impact of the argument on existing conflicts or conflicts that are underway. So one of the things you brought up is this idea that Doug McAdam, Sid Tarrow, Chuck Tilley, and others have advanced, that actually the system in which these movements arise predisposes them to success or failure, as well as to nonviolent or violent resistance. So in other words, in easy contexts, like democracies, it should be more likely that people use the easy tactic, nonviolent resistance, or easy method of nonviolent resistance, and it should be more likely that they win because it's easy. So in places where it's hard, you should see people using the harder technique, violence, and you should be seeing it less likely to succeed because it's hard. So this is the technical term for this difficulty theoretically is endogeneity. Which is a word that no activist has ever appreciated my bringing up. Because one of the things that it says to people on the ground is that you're actually not determining actually your choices. Your choice set is already completely limited by your environment, and nothing that you can do is going to affect it because your environment predisposes you to success or failure. Now that's kind of a caricature of the political opportunity argument. McAdam argues that actually it's more of a process of interaction, and that the strategic interaction between opponent and challenger and third parties is really what determines the outcome, but there's no predictive power at all because of the complexity of this. So scholars like them really tell us, don't even bother to sort of come up with generalities. Instead, what you should do is just focus on descriptive analysis of things that have already taken place. Now, in my case, there are a couple things. One is I tried to deal with the endogeneity issue in our 2011 book. There's a whole chapter devoted to this issue of, do your circumstances preordain your choice of nonviolent and violent resistance and the outcome of success or failure? And we found actually using all kinds of different statistical techniques and qualitative techniques that there was actually no support for that the findings held even when we took into account this potential endogenous process. And many other people have since replicated that by using instrumental variable analysis and other techniques. So there is actually something to the general argument, the general descriptive statistic that nonviolent resistance, despite the setting, tends to have higher success rates than its violent counterparts, precisely because of the set of interactions that then become available to the dissidents and to the opponent. It actually limits the opponent's range much more than the dissidents, whereas violence does not limit the opponent's range, but it very much limits the range for the dissidents. That's how I would put it. In terms of how do we intervene, I'm working on a project right now with Maria Steffen where we're collecting data on all kinds of different kind of actors that can, or that have provided support to nonviolent movements and the types of support that they provided. So for example, faith communities, transnational solidarity networks, foreign governments, corporations, foreign media, different types of actors that have kind of come in and try to influence in some way the situation, largely to defend or protect or support the nonviolent resistance campaign. And what we're very interested in is understanding which types of support by which types of supporters help these campaigns more than hurt them. And so I don't know yet, but hopefully we'll know in a year when we're finished with the book. You're quite right to point out that civil resistance and nonviolence are not the same thing conceptually or practically. In fact, one of the things I'm always telling my students is that there's a big difference between nonviolence, not violent, non-violent, and doing nothing. And each of those has its own set of practices and associations. Nonviolence is a set of principles and kind of morally informed choices about the way one wants to live one's life. And that can often entail mobilization, but it can often also just entail a set of guidelines that people want to live by. Not violent is really a lot of things. It's anything. I'm being not violent right now, as far as I know. And then there's also non-violent action, which is not necessarily, it's certainly not violent, but it's also not necessarily advancing anything. You know, it's just people behaving in a nonviolent interaction. So there's a big set of differences with regard to civil resistance, which has a civic quality to it. It is, as you mentioned, organized. There's a qualitative difference to the level of organization and capacity required to engage in civil resistance. The tank man photo that you put up is kind of the bane of a lot of people's existence in this field because it's what people associate with the technique, but in fact, it's sort of like the, there's a lot of people that in the terrorism world of scholars often get this question when they're trying to say that torture is wrong. And then they get this question of, well, what if you have the ticking bomb and you have the person who set it and you have 15 minutes to get the answer to save 10,000 people? It's sort of setting up this hyperbolic hypothetical. Tank Man is like the hyperbolic hypothetical of why civil resistance fails, right? Because people are like, look at Tank Man. He had no hope. He, it was very brave, but he wasn't going to, change the communist government of China. Yeah, that's correct. He was not. He was not going to change anything. He was being very brave. He was engaging in a personal act of civil disobedience, and that's not what civil resistance necessarily is. Civil resistance is not necessarily protest. Not all protest is civil resistance either. In democracies, protest is so normal that many civil resistance scholars don't even consider it civil resistance because it's legal. It's not, it's legal, it's normal, it's part of our routine. So that, asks this question of what is different about it. And certainly the mass dimension and the organization dimension are what's different about it. And so there's a very important study by Jonathan Sutton, Charles Butcher, and Isak Svensson that argues that one-sided violence, which is episodes where a state kills like 100 people and some kind of collective action, in cases since 1990, where there have been episodes of one-sided violence, if they were against protests that were not associated with any larger campaign, they always succeeded, meaning they crushed the protests. But in cases where the episodes of one-sided violence were against protests that were associated with a broader nonviolent campaign, 50% of the time, those campaigns ended up overthrowing the dictator, in spite of the one-sided violence. So it really speaks to the necessity of an organizational infrastructure that can maneuver, right? Can allow the people power to be resilient to this type of thing and to maneuver in the context of escalation of repression. Your last question about it's easier to mobilize or use civil resistance in a democracy. Most of the data that I presented were campaigns in either non-democracies or against democratic military occupiers. It's actually, there's the civil resistance campaigns are more likely to set on in authoritarian regimes of the kind that I'm studying here because of the maximalist claims. And it has no impact on whether they succeed or not. That said, as I mentioned, it's very easy to protest in democracies.
But the key is not the non-violence. Is that the movements that succeed are organized movement with a key action definition, with also a core identity, and so the non-violence is a visible aspect of it. But if you don't have a mass of people, then sure, the government, as you say, 5% of the population with an organization, they can do lots of, damage to the. So it's not. What is bothering here for lots of people, not me, I'm just restituting here lots of discussion, is that it should be called civil resistance.
I agree.
And that, because the idea, again, I'm not interested only in the academic part of it. Indigenous is not the point. The point is people have to mobilize, right? And I'm concerned by, the brides. That's what concerned me. The point is not to go out and say stop and we are for peace. The point is to have people aware that there are things to do to be efficient. You need some kind of Gandhi somewhere, and that's a very different take about the non-violence. That's what I'm saying here.
Oh, yeah.
And for me, this is the practical implication, because young people, maybe I am wrong or too old, but they tend to be romantic, we got pizza and this. You need organization, and then maybe you will be successful in your nonviolent movement. Sorry, I don't want to.
No, I totally agree. I think it's quite true. And I use the term civil resistance because of this, because I think it is dangerous to conflate. I think it's dangerous to conflate kind of a naive attachment to the use of nonviolent resistance as a form of righteous presentation or performance with success. Yeah. I mean, not all these campaigns, you don't succeed because you're nonviolent. You succeed because you do politics better, right? So, but it just turns out that the campaigns that do politics better also have the nonviolent dimension. But I agree with you, and that's why it's my term of choice.
Enough of us, yes. The lady. I give priority to the RPP people. That's for the 10 minutes. So I don't know if you're RPP.
Thank you both very much for everything. This isn't on. Okay. I struggle a lot between the term, or maybe I don't struggle, I go back and forth between civil resistance and nonviolent action. And since I hear you both really going towards civil resistance, I kind of want to question that a little more, because it seems that many of the reasons why people are doing politics better in the nonviolent cases seem to be as a result, as Erica pointed out, of the value that nonviolent action, being nonviolent, is having for their group. And I also consider the fact that not being aware of the power of violence or nonviolent action could be partly responsible for the decrease in effectiveness in nonviolent campaigns and a turn to violence that we've seen being correlated with less effectiveness. So, and I think it can be confusing with the literature too, because I think in a lot of cases civil resistance and nonviolent action in the literature has been used to mean the same thing. So I just wanted to kind of raise some caution about that, and I wanted to hear if you had any further thoughts given these considerations.
Yeah. Well, I'll just mention one thing. There are two concerns I had with using the term civil resistance, three concerns. The first is that the second word, resistance, suggests that you have to be opposing something at all times, that you have to be opposing something kind of on the defensive almost, right? And so it kind of precludes, at least in people's minds, a whole category of nonviolent action, which is intervention and the development of parallel institutions or constructive program. So it sort of suggests you're never going to be on the initiative or taking the initiative. You're always going to be on resisting oppression, because oppression is just always going to be there. So it kind of prefigures a constraint on the scope of our imagination about what's possible. The second concern I have is that the term civil has some kind of colonial origins, civilization, related to pacification, meaning respectability, meaning be a good, respectable civilian citizen, that I think can have some difficult connotations, particularly in post-colonial contexts where people don't want to be told that they're being civilized by their behavior where they're trying to be really militant. And then the third thing that's difficult about it is exactly the point you brought up, which was this point of making it less clear that part of the rationale for the technique is kind of contingent on people maintaining nonviolent discipline, right? So I still prefer it more than nonviolent action in this country at this time, because I think that contextually there is less baggage associated in the United States with the term civil resistance in practice than the term nonviolent action, which in this country people associate with nonviolence and, you know, in the most derogatory thing they could say, kumbaya, respectability politics or whatever. And so I actually think civil resistance connotes a more kind of aggressive or assertive position. And in this country at this time, I think it's easier to bring people along on exactly the concept that you're talking about. On the other hand, I do have concerns with it. I just think it's the least worst of the terms. You know, and there's a great example some of you are probably familiar with, where Robert Helvey went to do a training with some Burmese rebels on their invitation a couple decades ago. And he showed up and he said, "I'm here to do my presentation on the strategic dimensions of nonviolent struggle." And they were like, no, that's not what we wanted you to come here for. We're rebels, we're militants. And he was like, "Oh, right, I forgot. I'm doing my presentation on political defiance." And they were like, "That's the one." So he just, you know, he did a quick change to his slides and gave the same talk, right? So, but the nomenclature really matters. And, you know, in practice, it's really important to sort of know where we're at and what deck we've been dealt. And I think in the United States, we've been dealt a deck where, you know, right now, it's easier for people to get what you mean when you say civil resistance compared to nonviolent action.
I just want to say one thing which I don't agree with is your reading of civil resistance. It is not read, knowing lots of different contexts outside the West, as colonial. And even if it has a colonial origin, people have agencies in this area. They have utilized it. They even talk about civil state. The term civil has really not been seen anymore as a sort of imposition on them. So I would be very, for me, this is an ideological position more than reflecting the reality on so I would be very cautious here. Again, I understand where does it come from a good heart, but the reality is people use the term, want to be seen this way, and it's not negative. A civil resistance, if it's done in the way that Mahatma Gandhi did it, it's certainly not passive or reactive. So that's yes, Nadia. Yeah.
Thank you so much for your talk. I just have two quick questions of clarification. One is, where do you situate actions of, I don't know, maybe self-violence in your theory? So, for example, actions of self-immolations in Tunisia that started the Arab Spring, or so-called Arab Spring. I just was wondering how you define them. The second is, how do you understand the role of routinization of an audience or a society to violence? So, for example, a violent action can have different impact on nonviolent groups that are comparable in terms of their ideology and strategy, depending on the political history of the country. For example, in Lebanon, there is sort of habituation and routinization of political violence because of the history of the country, whereas in Tunisia, after the Arab Spring, we had 2 political assassinations that were seen as a drama. And when I talked to my friends in Lebanon, they were like, oh, we don't care about 2 political assassins. So I was wondering how then you translate this into your theory. And just a last question that I was really interested in, your last part about the role of faith and spirituality. I was wondering whether you could say a bit more about how you see the conditions for a productive interaction between secular movements and faith-based movements, because I realized that there is only so much that can be accomplished when the minute you bring religion in the conversation. Like when you have a deep conversation about religion, it tends to create divisions. And it's interesting that you brought up the example of Barber, and he uses the category of morality because it's more inclusive. But whenever you start having deep conversations about theology or religious traditions, there are many disagreements. As you said, a lot of resistance coming from secular groups, because there may be some agreement on refugees or poverty, but the minute you bring identity or LGBT rights, it's much more divisive. So, I mean, this is a question I'm really wondering and struggling with, like normatively and strategically, based on your work, what do you think are ways to move forward with this impasse and dead end? Thank you.
Should we take a couple? Or should
Yeah, we take a couple. I'm going to go the other way because, yes.
Thank you very much. My question just resolves, I mean, it sounds to me like the violence and nonviolence are mutually exclusive, but there's often an argument that says, you know, the nonviolent movements are successful because there is a violent movement, right? So I'm just curious, how do you usually answer to that question?
Okay. Yes. I take another one and then. Yeah, the gentleman here. Yes.
Thank you. Erica, thank you very much for a great presentation, and thanks for your work in general. First question, I wanted to focus in on your last point about the decline in success of these movements over the last 10 years. I'm wondering if you see a global normative explanation, in addition to the one you gave about the declining role of spirituality in that. I noticed that, you know, in the data you gave, there's a real spike in the increase of effectiveness and success over the 1990s, which correlates with that sort of golden decade when democratic regimes increased dramatically during that period of time. It's in between '89, the end of the Cold War, and 2001, and the beginning of sort of the War on Terror. I was thinking, when you mentioned the Serbian example, actually the one that came to mind actually was Tiananmen Square, where the military eventually did fire on protesters in '89, and you go back to '72 with Bloody Sunday and so on, which are just anecdotal examples, but it seems like there was maybe a normative shift during that period of time, and I'm wondering whether over the last 10 years there's been a normative shift in the other direction. And the other thing that correlates interestingly with your drop in success is the rise of the internet, which I found sort of paradoxical. We, at least in the work in the field, you know, we have so much hope in terms of internet and social media helping these movements to be able to organize and so on. So I'm just curious if you've thought along those lines on that. And just real quick on a second question about the vision piece that you were talking about. The neck of the woods that I work in is more in West Africa, and interfaith movements actually have a tremendous role in providing some spiritual vision in a lot of the nonviolence movements, peace movements that happen in the region. And I'm wondering whether you've, in your data sets, have you sort of plumbed in a little bit into some of the interfaith components of this? Because what's really interesting, at least in this part of the world that I look at, but I think in other parts as well, is that the interfaith movements have a really important role in sort of moving enough beyond a single religion so that the entire sort of movement itself has sort of a broader political agenda that comes outside of just the one religious pocket that it may have originated in, and providing something that's a little bit maybe easier to mobilize, but still has that strong ethical component and that spiritual motivational component that you were talking about. Thank you.
Right.
Oh, you have a lot to respond
Great.
to.
Sure.
And then I will take a second round.
Second round. Okay. So on this question about how do we categorize self-violence or self-immolation, it is a gray area. Most people, myself included in the field, do not count it as violence because the definition of violence is usually a strict one that requires the direct physical harm of another. But it is definitely a gray area because it's unclear the sort of psychological or political effects that self-immolation in particular might have on others. So sort of how it's read locally, I think, could complicate that, which is why a lot of scholars question that category. But I think right now that's kind of where the field is on it. The second question you had about how do we deal with the routinization of a society to violence. In my research, what I try to do is account for kind of peace years or duration of existing conflict as a proxy for how routine violence is in a society, to understand whether that affects the outcome of a nonviolent campaign or the likelihood of the onset of it. It's also an important factor in trying to figure out what happens to the society after a major mobilization of any kind, a nonviolent or violent one. If a society has a long-standing kind of history of internal violence, it may be more likely that, even after a nonviolent campaign, for example, they'd be more predisposed to relapse into civil war because of existing polarization or infrastructural incapacity. And in fact, the existence of a pre-existing conflict doesn't affect the onset of a nonviolent campaign or whether it succeeds, but it does predispose a society to higher risks of relapse into civil war after, which simply is kind of the unsurprising finding that societies who are in the civil war trap really need a lot of help to get out of it, regardless of whether they have a civil resistance campaign or not. One of the things to point out is that that's kind of using a series of proxy indicators that are large-scale internal conflict and don't necessarily mean different forms of criminal violence, violence against women, domestic violence, things like that. And I think one could do quite a productive study on trying to understand those dimensions. In terms of one of the more important factors in understanding the kind of relapse into civil war as well, neighborhood is actually more important than a country's own history. So for example, if you're bordering a couple of states that have an armed internal conflict, you're more likely to get one just because there's really dramatic population flows. As a result, there can often be a lot of instability on borders and things like that, and it can lead to kind of internal instability. So those are just some things from within the literature. Your question about what is the most productive interaction between faith-based communities and movements today. A lot of the contributions of faith communities that I mentioned really are kind of like pragmatic ones. They see faith communities as sites for capacity building and increased political leverage. And I think that that's probably the most productive source of cooperation with largely secular movements. On the other hand, I think the comment that was just made about interfaith communities, that's kind of a different animal, because then they're kind of coming together on a set of more kind of universal ethical principles that already, as a function of their being interfaith, have kind of already bridged in a way that may then appeal to more secular activists. But I think in most Western democracies right now, this is tough because of the kind of distance that's been put between a lot of different progressive movements and the church over the past 30 years. And it's something that can be, revived, but it just is going to take some effort, I think. The question about what happens, or what is the interaction between violent flanks and the success of nonviolent movements. This is a very popular argument that many nonviolent campaigns succeed because they have an armed wing that's sort of increasing their leverage or increasing their ability to look like the good guys in light of these much more dramatic, radical militants. I've tested this in an article that I wrote with Kurt Schock that was published in 2015, where we looked at the effects of violent flanks on the aggregate success rates of nonviolent campaigns and found that they actually reduce the success of primarily nonviolent campaigns. And we think this is primarily because they almost never actually really increase the bargaining space for the nonviolent component. They actually just subject them to greater risk, because most of the states that are confronting these movements don't actually differentiate between the nonviolent and the violent dissidents. As soon as a violent dissident group becomes organized, they're all the same, right? Especially if they are close. And so, you see the same level of assassination campaigns and other types of suppression take place against the nonviolent actors as the violent ones. And even if there are kind of momentary concessions where they're trying to reward the nonviolent actors for playing fair, those are almost never long-standing. And in fact, the communities that the violent flanks purport to represent are usually placed at much greater risk of larger scale and more intense repression. We also see that movements that embrace violent flanks tend to become smaller and more homogenous in their participants. So that then reduces the ability to elicit those third-party supporters and those defections. In terms of the global normative change, so here's what keeps me up at night, for real, is the question of whether the rise of nonviolent resistance after World War II and into the current decade is really a function of the post-war human rights normative environment and the sort of liberal international order, which is now unraveling. And whether what we've now created is an expectation that nonviolent mass resistance is possible and effective, when actually it's going to become increasingly dangerous over time because of changes in the global normative environment. It's obviously too early to know, but that's one of the things that in this recent decline worries me slightly. I actually think the most convincing arguments for this decline are less about the violent flanks and more about the wising up, so to speak, of authoritarian regimes and becoming less willing or less likely to use the bluntest instruments of force and using much more smart repression, which they've laid out in very explicit documents where they've tried to lay out their techniques that they've been using to suppress nonviolent dissent in their countries or preempt it in the first place. So I think part of it is explained by that and sharing of that knowledge across different authoritarian and semi-authoritarian regimes. The techniques are well documented. They're things like always blaming outsiders and foreigners for the unrest, which you'll see every single one of them do now, basically. They try to discredit the movement actors and dissidents by calling them criminals or terrorists or traitors or coup plotters. They will use a variety of forms of intimidation, harassment, and burden increasing by like raising student debts and making the administrative burden for organizing in their countries much higher so that many groups can't do it. They use selective terror to scare people. And then they round up the most skilled dissidents and put them in jail on corruption charges or sexual assault charges or whatever they can come up with. And so it's a very difficult time to be like a nonviolent dissident in Russia, for example, which is like the place where many of these techniques were honed and articulated and then shared with Russian allies. So I think basically, that might explain part of it, but not all of it, because the movements still emerge. So your second point about the rise of the internet, I think, is really important on this. I think that one of the things that that digital communication has done is it's made it much easier for people to learn about the end game of nonviolent campaigns, but not the entire run-up to it, where there was planning, organization, visioning, and all of the things that make for a successful nonviolent campaign. So sometimes it's very easy to see from videos and 2-minute clips about a nonviolent campaign that if you go to the streets for 17 days, you can topple a dictator. And that's the total wrong lesson to learn from any of these successful campaigns. A lot of the people in the Serbian bulldozer revolution will say things like 95% of what we did was planning and preparation, and only 5% were actions. So if all you see on the internet is people taking action and mobilizing prematurely, then it's not surprising that people are doing it and then failing more often. So I think there might be a combination of the two. And then, I don't have data on interfaith movements specifically. The NAVCO 2 data has a variable called religious diversity in describing a campaign in a given year, but it's got a lot of missing data because it's really hard to know in some of these campaigns. We don't have a lot of really good primary materials on that variable. And I think that there's a huge possibility of people taking the data that we've already collected and adding out new variables that are of interest to people that want to understand the association between religion, interfaith communities, and spirituality in these movements and their outcomes. So it's like an open field as far as I know.
Okay, there were. Please.
Yeah, thank you for your presentation. I was just wondering your point about how nonviolence increases the riskiness of repression. I'm wondering, in your research, do you see, I don't know what to call them anymore, nonviolent or civil resistance actors grappling with maybe the implication of that is to push and provoke something awful happening? I'm thinking the case I'm most familiar with is the U.S. Civil Rights Movement, where they were definitely grappling with sort of the implications of that. Is that just something that you've encountered, that moral question being raised?
Yeah. Do you want to?
I don't see any. Okay. Oh, here.
Thank you so much, Erica. I was wondering regarding the point of the learning curve of dictators. So knowing that it's getting harder to organize, to exercise nonviolent resistance, which strategies can help these movements to be more effective in face that their adversaries are taking a step ahead and are using some strategies to dilute what they're trying to create?
I take one more. Yes.
Hi, thank you so much. I have two questions. One is, in your statistic of 3.5% of the population, if you have looked into it all, defining if there are different subsets of that population that lead to more successful outcomes for movements. For example, if 3.5% of the population could include mostly young adults or mostly people of a certain demographic or certain constituency within that.
Mm-hmm. I let you respond.
Great.
I think it's going to be the last round, no?
Okay. So thanks for these questions. The first one is are there examples where movements have really grappled with the moral issue of how much to provoke an incident of mass repression? Certainly all of these movements, in my data set at least, I think face the possibility, a very real possibility, of mass repressive episodes. And in well-documented cases like Gandhi's Salt March, they fully anticipated that they were going to experience mass repression and engaged in a great deal of preparation, personal, spiritual, and physical, to absorb it. And there were lots of people killed in the aftermath of the Salt March, during the assault on the Salt, industrial factories and things like that. And it was just, it was the type of thing where the explanation was we have to be prepared to absorb losses, just like any type of military campaign would. People being killed by an oppressive system is not a failure of nonviolent resistance. It is what an oppressive system is. It's dramatizing the fangs of it, as Gandhi said. And in the civil rights movement, I think one of the key moments where this debate became the most poignant was in the aftermath of the killing of 4 girls in the context of a march, where MLK was sort of brought to the carpet and questioned by some of the people in the sort of inner circle of the SCLC, and SNCC and sort of said, like, is this really what we want to be doing? And what he said was, those girls are going to be equally exposed to the violence of this system, whether they're marching in the streets or whether they're walking to school. And so it is the system that killed those girls, and us marching to try to protect our children is the only way out. So I think that it's incredibly complex, a really important moral question that I think most of these movements that have any staying power at all have to face down. The second question, in light of a potential learning curve among dictators, what should movements do? I think the key takeaway here is to avoid a situation where they're mobilizing prematurely, like where the lesson that they learn is just like, let's bring people to the streets and then try to organize them, and sort of to reverse that, organize and then mobilize, because the opponents are incredibly skilled and savvy at this point. Another thing is a lot of people have gotten caught in online organizing because it's so susceptible to interference or surveillance. And so, it's a characteristic of our time that people use digital tools to try to communicate, but they're all very public now. And so it can be really costly. And then I haven't looked at whether there are particular subsets of populations that can themselves constitute the 3.5% of the population that would be that revolutionary threshold. But I do think that in cases where, for example, the claims are being made by a minority in the country, it's very difficult to win, like especially a secession campaign, by just mobilizing 3.5% if it was only constituted of that population. Because in East Timor, for example, it was a very deliberate choice to branch out and form links with Indonesian students in Jakarta and other kind of major cities within Indonesia, who then helped to leverage the kind of political power through international networks to bring the East Timorese issue to the international community's attention. And if they hadn't done that, if they didn't have kind of a solidarity effort, it was just a tiny place that, that the bad things were going to happen without anybody watching. And so, I think that there's something to the type of movement that you're operating and like whose support is necessary in order to achieve that third-party leverage.
Okay, I think we have come to the end of this session. I'm going to wrap up. I just want to say one thing on the role of religion and interfaith movement. Again, the danger is always to isolate the religious actors in one box. What experience shows is that when religious groups are called upon for broader kind of concern, like the Colombian example I was talking about, which means that it should not be about faith and secular, which is kind of, the tendency we see to see the division between the two. And there are objectives that can be raised that bring people together. Education was one of those, but again, there is no list. It depends on the context. And it makes it much more challenging when religion, what we call in the latent phase of the conflict, has already been a divisive issue between people, even before the conflict starts. And that's a problem that I think is a problem for lots of Muslim countries, To go back to the Tunisian example, secular and Islamists could talk to each other because they had an experience of sharing the prison of Ben Ali. So it was not so much that, they were divided by religion, but much more unified in the desire to go beyond the system as it was. So that's the kind of thing we have seen around. So I would thank you very much. And call back Dean Hampton for the final wrap-up and survey announcement.
Yeah, just a few announcements. First of all, I'd really like to thank our presenter, Erica Chenoweth and Jocelyne Cesari, for a really wonderful conversation. There's a lot at stake in these issues, and to have serious data collection and evaluation and serious interpretive methods it is really important, actually, not just for the past, but as many of the questions were indicating, for the present and the future. I mean, how do we think the best way possible about this kind of civil resistance, or whatever term we want to use for that, and whether there are these global trends that are rightly keeping you up awake at night, whether there are trends that are going to make it much more difficult for nonviolent civil resistance movements to succeed in their objectives. So thank you for opening up a really important topic, and for helping us connect it a little bit to faith traditions and spiritual movements, not as oppositional or separate estates of the realm, but how they might relate in some way is something we're really interested in pursuing in our RPP Colloquium. So thank you very much. The Harvard COOP will have copies of Erica Chenoweth's book, Why Civil Resistance Works, The Strategic Logic of Nonviolent Conflict, for sale during the reception. So if your appetite has been whetted by this and you'd like to study more deeply, please pick up a copy of the book. And then just a few announcements. If you're not yet familiar with the work of the programs that co-sponsored tonight's event, please be sure to check out the Women's Studies and Religion program at Harvard Divinity School and the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy at the Kennedy School. Our next RPP Colloquium is on March 1st and will feature Reverend Dr. Ray Hammond from Boston, speaking on ministry to the marginal, the power of partnerships. So thank you very much for that. And now I think we have some gift exchanges or even gift presentations. So thank you so much.
I appreciate
it.
Thank you.